Hey folks, David Stewart here. Time for some more Storycraft. Today it is the horror of the zombie, or actually more appropriately, the horror of zombies. Now before I dig into the meat of this video, I want to say that there's actually really two different approaches to zombies, and I have to distinguish between those because they produce different stories. One is basically everything that comes before George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which focuses on kind of Caribbean voodoo zombies, and everything that comes after George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which really focuses on apocalyptic kind of scenarios, disaster scenarios surrounding zombies. And these two approaches to zombies produces two very, very different approaches to stories in general. The stories that are told with zombies before Night of the Living Dead are very different than those told afterwards. So I'm going to focus more on the ones told after Night of the Living Dead because that tends to be really monolithically what we think of as zombie media today in 2020 and in recent years. I'd say the legacy of George Romero has really wiped from many people's memories the idea of zombies that existed prior to that, these sort of Haitian voodoo zombies. All of that has been kind of just not part of the current discussion and consciousness surrounding zombies, but I still want to talk about them. So the horror of the zombie. A zombie by itself doesn't seem like a super scary creature when you stop and think about it. A zombie is rather slow. He's mindless to some degree, and that makes him pretty easy to kill, even if you can only kill him by, say, destroying the brain, or depending on what media, just killing it the way that you would kill a normal person. Doesn't make for a particularly intimidating monster, but the thing is about zombies, the reason that they're scary in general is that you have more than one. And so once you realize that the horror of the zombie is really not the fear of one zombie, which you can just shoot in the head, and it will probably amble rather slowly towards you while groaning, waiting for you to shoot it in the head, but rather that there'll be hundreds of zombies converging on your position, and you can't really kill them all, and you have to figure out what you're going to do in response to that. And again, this has really been the focus of how zombies as a monster work after Night of the Living Dead. If you go before that, zombies are a little bit different. They're voodoo zombies. And really the first zombie movie that I can think of is White Zombie. It came out in the very early 1930s, I think 1932. I have it on DVD somewhere. It's a good early movie to watch if you want to watch a movie about this, but the story is not at all like the stories that we would get in zombie media after Night of the Living Dead. This story surrounds a kind of jealous love and the use of unnatural powers and then their consequences. So White Zombie is about turning people into zombies. There's like a plantation owner who, like, all of his crops are harvested by zombies, and a guy has some unrequited love feelings towards this woman, and they come up with a scheme to turn her into a zombie so that he can have her. Now this seems a little bit gross and perverse, and it is, and that's kind of the point of what you're doing there. And then the plot basically flows from there. So essentially it is a story about a conflict of love. Now that's very different from what we get with modern zombie media, where the focus of the story tends to be survival, and rather than the zombies being tools of a malevolent personality like you get with the voodoo zombies, the Caribbean zombies. Zombies are kind of a force of nature, and they represent disaster kind of falling onto the characters, and then the characters have to react to that. Now, what is common in both of these is that the stories remain essentially human-focused stories. The conflict is always between people. This is something that exists in a lot of horror stories, not just zombies or anything like that, but the threat of the zombie is something that provokes people into action or is a temptation to power, like with the voodoo zombies, but the conflict is really between people. So in White Zombie, it's about this desiring a woman who's going to marry somebody else, and the feelings of jealousy that cause you to do something that is reprehensible and disgusting. And if you look at something like Night of the Living Dead, the conflict is surrounding people, their inability to work together, the difficulties that they have regarding cowardice, making decisions as a unit in order to increase their survival, mistakes they make along the way, and those sorts of things that ultimately end up causing the doom of much of the party in Night of the Living Dead. And that's something that I think gets echoed through a lot of zombie media. Is you hear it said, the people are the real monsters, but that's not really true. It's really that the conflict is between people, because that's where conflict exists in a story. Zombies as a mindless monster cannot be reasoned with. This is part of what makes them frightening. They can't be reasoned with. They can't be stopped. They have no will of their own. They have no specific desires that can be negotiated with. And unlike a bear, especially in the more apocalyptic zombie stories, killing a zombie doesn't really do that much. Ultimately, you can't defeat your opponent. Your opponent is a shambling corpse and will continue to pursue you until it's utterly destroyed. And then there's hundreds of more after it, meaning it's basically hopeless to try to overcome the plague. Now, that's a little bit different than the voodoo zombies. In the voodoo zombies, usually you have a story that revolves around, say, like killing the voodoo master, which will maybe release the zombies from the spell or something like that. You are trying to resolve the threat of the zombies. After George Romero, the threat of zombies is something that really can't be completely overcome. Rather, the story focused is on survival. It's a man versus nature story. If you guys remember themes like that, maybe from your education years, it's man versus nature in a George Romero style story versus man, which is what you have in stories that predate Night of the Living Dead. But either way, you have a monster that is not going to be reasoned with and can't be easily overcome or destroyed. Rather, you have to find a different way to overcome them. In the case of a movie like White Zombie, it's destroying the voodoo master, which will release the zombies. And that's something that is kind of typical in plots that follow that movie up until Night of the Living Dead. Now, as far as the real horror of the zombies, the fact that they're this force of nature, you actually don't want to be a zombie. And this is something that goes all the way back to White Zombie, the earliest zombie movie, and maybe even before it, to the ideas of voodoo. There was a book called The Magic Island that was put out that had some supposedly eyewitness accounts of voodoo magic from the Caribbean being performed, and kind of brought the idea of zombies into the consciousness of people. It goes all the way back to there. To be a zombie is worse than being dead. If you're dead, you're released from the toils of this life. You're released from, the imprisonment of the body, especially from a Christian perspective. And although we've become more secular, more materialist as we've gone on, definitely the horror of the zombie is that you are not released from it. That when you die, you aren't merely dead. You become a slave in those early ones. You become a servant of the voodoo master. You lose your will and your ability to operate as an individual, and in essence, you lose your soul. And this is an existential threat, not merely a physical threat. A bear coming to bite your head off, that's more like a physical threat. Having a zombie bite you and then have you slowly succumb to like a zombie disease and become a servant of the voodoo master is an existential threat that threatens your very soul. It threatens your ability to comprehend reality. So it's a little bit more frightening to think of being a zombie. And it actually used to be something that I think I had a particular... I wouldn't say love of, but it affected me, was the idea of imagining being a zombie. And I remember these old Marvel horror books that they would come out with. This is way back before you really got... I mean, this kind of stuff just went away like in the 1990s. But I remember one where, it was like a zombie. It was a zombie book, and it was from the perspective of the zombie. And the zombie was this mindless thing rising from his where his body had been left in the swamp to go do the bidding of his master, kind of more in that voodoo area. And I just remember it being a horrifying idea that you would lose your will to have control over your actions, that you would lose your ability to be yourself. And that is an existential horror of the zombie. As far as the threat of the zombie plague, like what we have now, it really is just about surviving a natural disaster and figuring out how to overcome that. And there's a couple of different areas of, say, the zombocalypse, the zombie apocalypse, where stories exist and we get really interesting conflicts that arise from them. There's the apocalyptic, or there's isolated conflicts. There's like the apocalyptic, and then there's the post-apocalyptic. And from right now, most people tend to be focusing on the post-apocalyptic, things like The Last of Us, that really focuses on the post-apocalyptic. You have this prelude to the story or prologue that shows the apocalypse beginning, but you don't really get any of the details of how that apocalypse plays out. Rather, we have a time skip and we see Joel years later and older after all of that has resolved, and now you're in the post-apocalyptic realm where there's vast areas of danger out there populated by these zombies. It's a really that tends to be where the focus is. Now, apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic have different foci for how the story works. In an apocalyptic setting, it's about survival. In a post-apocalyptic setting, it's also about survival, but rather than there being a rising unknown threat, it's about how you reconstruct society, how you reform social bonds, how you form groups to ensure future survival further down the line, and what kinds of weird, social arrangements people make in the fallout from the apocalypse. So apocalyptic fiction would be something like Stephen King's The Stand, which really is about the fall and what immediately follows it. Post-apocalyptic is like Fallout, where the apocalypse has already happened and society has already reorganized itself. And what's interesting is to look at whatever the writer's vision for how that society would have been reorganized. And so the human conflicts are different for those. So with apocalyptic fiction, and you're dealing with this horrible threat of zombies, the question is always, how are we going to survive this? What actions do we need to take to ensure our survival? And the tragedy of the Night of the Living Dead, why I think it's so influential in the genre, is that basically the people aren't able to work together. They aren't able to be a cohesive unit to ensure their survival. We have people acting in cowardly ways. You have people acting in selfish ways. You have people making mistakes. And it all ends up coming down to just one survivor, Ben. And of course, he gets mistaken for a ghoul and accidentally killed at the end of the film. I shouldn't have to warn you for spoilers. This is one of the most popular movies in the entire genre. If you haven't seen it by now, then you should definitely go watch it. It's a classic movie, and I think a really, really good one as well. So the way that an apocalypse really shakes down the disaster level. So Night of the Living Dead is like about surviving the disaster, and that's kind of the smaller level. It's really just about how people figure out how to work together. On the apocalyptic level, it's like about escaping from the zombies. That'd be like something like maybe 28 Days Later. Kind of takes place in that later phase of an apocalypse of zombies. And then when you get to post-apocalyptic, it's say Land of the Dead, where you have society is reorganized, or The Last of Us, which I've talked about recently on the channel. Society is reorganized in a number of interesting ways to deal with this zombie threat, and what does it mean? Now, I want to go a little bit deeper and talk about themes. I know this isn't specifically why zombies are scary, but one of the things that you get as a result of zombie movies is the question of what is human nature like. This is a really important one that pops up a lot in zombie media. Human nature, the question of what humans do in the absence of our carefully constructed society, has often been a question that philosophers have asked, particularly political philosophers. And so various types of political philosophies often start with the question of what is man like in the state of nature, absent the state. And if you're going with most versions of the realist political philosophy, it's basically, in the absence of big daddy government, it's war of all against all. It's chaos. People are killing each other. People are stealing from each other. It's a terrible, chaotic situation. If you have, say, a liberal, political theory liberal point of view, then you would view people in a state of nature as being primarily cooperative, and then dealing with conflict only, physical conflict is something that gets escalated to through prolonged inability to manage, say, common resources or social habits and actions and those sorts of things. So really it starts with cooperation because that's what that's what we do say in the family and tribe level, and then conflict only arises as you expand outward into larger groups. So which one of those you follow is going to produce a different story. I'd say in most zombie fiction, whether it's movies or game or something else, it's almost always taking a realist perspective, like Lord of the Flies, that in the absence of big daddy government, everybody's going to be slitting each other's throats 10 minutes into it. That without the iron hand of the state to bind people's behavior and stop them from acting like complete savages and lunatics, you would have chaos ensue. I almost never see one that takes the opposite perspective and really shows people being highly cooperative. And there's a reason for that, which is that cooperation is not nearly as interesting as conflict. So you want to make an interesting story, it's more interesting to make it about extreme conflict between people, savagery, violence. All of those sorts of things are going to make for a little bit more interesting story experience in general, because you're trying to hype up conflict than just going with the liberal perspective. Now, if you're looking at a series, say, The Walking Dead, AMC's The Walking Dead, it actually starts with a liberal point of view, but very quickly starts to go towards that realist view, that without like authority figures binding people and ruling over them, people become chaotic. Or you see that cooperation is short-lived, that very quickly somebody has that will to power, that Nietzschean will to power, and starts to assert their dominance, and then it becomes like a dystopian tyranny. And in most of these cases, you're looking through a lens of our current society and what people are like, and then projecting that forward into, in the absence of the state, what would people be like. And so very often I think that strikes a chord with people, because they know a lot of people that's like, man, if it weren't for this person would be completely unmanageable. And I think there's a lot of different ways of viewing that, but that tends to be what the focus is of zombies. So it's really easy for people to say, oh, it's people that are the real monsters. But if you actually take that and try to apply that to a zombie movie, and you're really just ignoring what the threat of the zombie means. The zombies mean an existential threat, but they also mean a physical threat that forces people into proximity in order to cooperate and survive. And so as soon as you get away from that zombie threat and start to really focus too much on how people are awful to each other, then it could be transplanted to anything, right? Any post-apocalyptic setting can contain people being awful to each other. Zombies are not special, so why are the zombies there? That's what you have to ask. In my opinion, if you're going to have something with zombies in it, the zombies should be really the primary threat. And one last thing I will say about the horror of zombies. There's a zombie game that I really enjoyed playing back in the day. That was Left 4 Dead. I liked the original Left 4 Dead much better than Left 4 Dead 2. I just feel like it's a better, creepier game. This is one that has that hordes of zombies running at you. There's a constant feeling of fear, like when are they going to pop out and try to kill me? Did I pick up enough ammo to do that? They really do work as sort of a constant threat of chaos. They're a chaotic threat, and you don't quite know what is going to come at you. That was a really interesting way that they approached the game, to have each playthrough is a little bit different, and I think that really goes towards the chaotic nature of zombies. Zombies are not predictable. They're a force that's out there, and as soon as you step out the door, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know where they're going to be or what exactly is waiting for you, and that can be used to great effect in lots of different horror genres. So the horror of the zombie. Let me know what you think down below in the comment section. I will see you guys next time. Every Thursday, I usually have a Storycraft video. So let me know what you think about the horror of the zombie. I'm going to do a couple more of these, like the horror of the vampire, the horror of the werewolf, and what makes us so afraid of these monsters. So the horror of the zombie is really that there's hordes of them, and we can't reason with them. We can't stop them. It's just we have to survive. So thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time. Oh, yeah. Newest book, Keys to Prolific Creativity. I don't have a copy of it here, but you should get it. It'll help you manage your creative process and improve your ability to actually come out with books or come out with music or art, whatever you happen to do. So thanks so much. I'll see you guys next time. And that's my horror book, Eyes in the Walls. You guys should read that one too. Very much beloved.